Hi, and welcome back to my shop. Well, I've really made some progress on my hanging wall cabinet project. Since the last episode, I went ahead and installed the hinges for the doors that hang on the top. It's a fairly straightforward process. I then started giving some thought as to additional detail or accents that I want to put on the piece. If you'll notice, the drawers on the bottom that are curved sort of blend into the bottom of the piece a little bit. And I wanted to think of ways that I might be able to make them stand out a little bit more and accent that gentle curve. As you can see here, I've taken a stab at simulating what some stringing detail might look like on the drawers. What I did is I used some white masking tape, and in this case I darkened it with a Sharpie. And then I did the same thing on this drawer, except I left it light colored because I wanted to see the difference between having some dark stringing versus some light stringing. Then of course the middle drawer here I just left plain. And really what I gravitated toward was using the light stringing. I think especially as this mahogany darkens, that will really stand out in contrast with the material over time. To get a better idea of what it might look like and how to best accomplish this task, I created a sample piece. So this has the white stringing all the way around, right on the edge of the piece. Now, the challenge I ran into when doing this right on the edge, essentially sitting it in a rabbet, is that you need to have the stringing wide enough so that it's catching enough long grain around each edge of the drawer. If this is too narrow, the only thing that's supporting it is the short grain or the end grain on the end of the sides, and so that's really not going to be that stable. So what I also did is tried using very thin, narrow stringing and having it sit in a groove just inside the edge. Now it's close enough that it almost looks like it's right at the edge of the piece, but in fact it's actually inset into a groove, holding it in place so I can use much thinner stringing like I have in the past, for example, with my walnut writing desk project. So this is kind of the example that I liked the best, and I'm going to show you next how I went about accomplishing this. Much like I did with my walnut writing desk project, I'm going to be using the stringing tools that I got from Lee Nielsen to do the grooves and to shape the stringing. Now, because this stringing is going to be very, very close to the edge on the front of these drawers, roughly 1/8 of an inch, I want to be very careful, especially on the ends here, because I'm going to have very little material supporting that end grain before I actually glue up the stringing. So I'm taking an extra step of using my marking gauge just to set that outside line to give me just an added level of protection. Now that I've got that outside line set, just enough to sever those fibers, then I can go and use the stringing tool to actually start cutting the channel. Now, the edge I'm doing right now, all I'm really going to do at this stage is score it, because there's an angle on the side here that's going to prevent me from being able to get the proper depth of this channel, because I'm going to bottom out the front of the gauge here before I get very far into cutting that channel. So I'm just essentially scoring those fibers and setting where that edge is going to be, which will make it easier for me to know where to stop when I come around this side and do the long grain. My very first pass is very light because I'm just trying to set the two edges that mark each side of this groove. Now that I've got the grooves cut, I'm going to take my marking knife, and because it's got that nice flat edge on one side, I'm going to use that to just sharpen up the corners. I'm going to go ahead and rip some strips of holly for my stringing. Then I'm going to put a very slight bevel on the bottom. There really is no bottom. I'm just picking one side to be the bottom, so I'll flip it around, keep that same side on top. And that's really what wedges the stringing into that groove. To cut the actual miters on my stringing, I'm going to use my 1-inch chisel and this little miter block that I've created. So all I have to do is register the back of that chisel on this fence, and I've got a mitered stop block here that I can push up against it, and then basically like a guillotine, just drop it down. And here you can see that nice miter that the chisel ends up creating. So with one end mitered, I can just sneak the stringing up so that I get it right in the corner of the groove, hold it down, and then I can just take my marking knife, drop it right inside so that I can mark the very tip of what I need the miter to look like on the other side. Then look for my mark and cut my second miter. Then just double check my fit. And this does require you to kind of wedge it in there a little bit because this is a slightly curved surface, so there's a tendency for these ends to want to pop up. But I got a nice clean fit there. Then I'll just turn it 90 degrees and repeat the process. Now, in order to glue up the stringing, I've taken some regular wood glue and I've diluted it very slightly with water just to get it a little less viscous. And what I'm going to do is I've got this little syringe, and so I'm going to pour the glue into the syringe, and that's how I'm going to administer the glue into these grooves. Here goes. Now I've devised this little method for really driving those pieces of stringing home. I have this piece of oak that I've cut a bunch of kerfs in to make it slightly flexible. Put some wax paper on the front of my piece so that this won't stick, and then I'm just going to clamp it to the inside of the drawer front. And it will actually curve slightly to meet the contour of the front. And it'll really drive those pieces of stringing deep into those grooves and take up any gaps. Now, before I can move on to the finish stage of this project, there's one other little detail I have to take care of. If you'll recall, back in the earlier stages of the project, I accidentally plunged my router too deep in the side of the case, and it went all the way through. So what I did, I took some tape and made little brown dots and applied them where that hole would be if I were to have two holes where each shelf ends up coming into play. So it'll look like those plugs that I'm going to use are actually sort of constructional elements of the project. Secondly, if I use mahogany end grain, it'll actually tie in really nicely with the end grain on the dovetails on the top and the bottom as well. So I'll show you how I'm going to go about doing that. I've simply gone and taken a piece of scrap mahogany actually and drilled a 1/4 inch hole through it. It's thick enough so that it'll register 90 degrees to the top of my carcass. Now I cut this on the drill press so that I know it's a perfect 90 degrees. So all I have to do is put the bit through, line up the point of my Forstner right in the crosshairs, drop this down and hold on to it. That's all there is to it. Now, I have to cut the plugs as well. So what I've done is I've sliced off a piece of mahogany end grain. It's actually the same piece of wood I used as my guide. And then it's just a matter of cutting the plug. Now I can start installing the plugs. And the beauty of using end grain like this is that there really isn't any grain alignment required because it's kind of just swirly grain. And then as you can see, the blue tape here plays a very vital role in that it protects the wood around it from getting glue all over it. Now that I'm all blue taped up, make sure that the right side is up on my flush trim saw. And it'll make pretty quick work of these pegs. Then just remove the blue tape carefully. Now for the, there's just a little remaining material there that is basically the width of the blue tape. I'm just going to use my block plane here, and that'll get me pretty close to the final surface, and then a little sandpaper will get me the rest of the way home. All right, I've got my entire piece all sanded down now. I've double checked the fit of everything. I got the drawers sliding in and out nicely. I've got the cabinet doors fitting flush. I also added a little door stop up here that actually has 2 rare earth magnets embedded in it. I just drilled 2 holes, put the rare earth magnets in, and then put a small piece of veneer over the front to hide them. So everything's ready to go now, and I can start applying the finish. I'm going to use boiled linseed oil for my first treatment, and then I'll determine what I want to do for a kind of final coat after that. In some previous episodes, you've seen me use heated boiled linseed oil. That's really not necessary in this case because mahogany is an open grain wood, so I'm not nearly as concerned about getting the oil to absorb. It's actually soaking up very easily at room temperature. So as I'm applying this first coat of oil, for the first time, you get to see that end grain, both from the pins, the dovetailing, as well as those end grain plugs that are sort of decorative on the side. Now for the back of the case, I've gone ahead and milled up this shiplapped cherry. It was just some scrap that I had lying around. So instead of just using plywood, I'll use hardwood with the shiplap joints, and that's a little bit more of a traditional look. I'm even using real cut nails to give this a truly authentic look and feel. Now I can move on to installing the drawer hardware. And lastly, the doors. Well, here you have it, the finished product. I've got all the hardware installed. The doors fit nicely. The little magnet mechanism that I used in this catch really works well, and it's subtle and you don't see any modern looking hardware in there. The drawer fit is really nice, and I think the stringing around the drawers really accents the fact that these are curved drawers and sort of draws your eye to that. And then if you'll recall, I went with the doweling on the sides to cover up where I accidentally routed a hole through when I was making the grooves to receive the shelves. I think that actually looks like a nice handmade touch, so I'm really happy with the way that came out. Again, even though it was an accident in the first place, it accents the pins and the dovetail work nicely. And then of course, you know, having the solid cherry shiplapped back adds another little handmade touch to the cabinet, even though you really only see it when the cabinet doors are open. So overall, I'm really happy with the end result of this project. It did end up taking a little bit longer than I expected, not only because I had a couple snafus here and there, but there is a lot of joinery. Even though this is a smaller piece, it doesn't necessarily always mean that it's going to be, you know, a shorter or easier project. But in the end, I'm really happy with the way it came out. I really like the finish and especially the materials selection. And I look forward to being able to put this out there in my store. So thanks for joining me for another project, and look forward to the next one shortly.